As the next panel begins to come out, let me do the introductions. This is the panel on the state of Arctic diplomacy. John and I talked a bit months ago about what was needed to underscore during this particular conference. And we felt that having current and former ambassadors, those who have worked in the Arctic for years, those who were engaged in the quote-unquote cooperation part, the engagement part of the Arctic discussion, that voice needed to be heard from different perspectives over different time spans. And we thought that it would be perfect at the end of the day and to precede the presentation by our Icelandic colleague with their chairmanship of the Arctic Council, now in progress, that a panel such as this that has perspective and can provide some thoughts for the future would be most helpful. So this panel, again, the state of Arctic diplomacy, it is moderated by our friend and colleague, Ray Arnaudo, former director, Office of Oceans and Polar Affairs, U.S. State Department. Ray, welcome back to Washington, D.C., and thank you, sir, for traveling all the way from Brussels to be with us today.
Thanks. Thanks, Mike, for the nice greeting. Delighted to be here. I don't know, Ken, do you want to say a few words to start, or should I lead this off and then?
I'd be glad to. Okay, I'd be glad to. This has been an extraordinary day, and I want to congratulate my old friend Mike Sfraga and all the others who put this together. Listening to all the discussion today, I certainly have been a strong proponent of keeping the Arctic to the extent possible as a zone of peace, cooperation, and stability. I am enough of a realist to recognize, that there are, some dark clouds out there today, which, have been discussed. But I think we haven't really focused on the role of diplomacy and the successes that we have seen as a result of diplomacy in the Arctic. A number of these things have been mentioned individually, but I want to go through several of them quickly and then offer some thoughts about how do we deal with, going back to Senator King's, charge of how do we handle these security issues. The Arctic Council obviously, has evolved very successfully over the years. And I want to point to the fact that it is now moving into the policy area as well. 3 agreements, concluded under its aegis on oil spills, on search and rescue, and on scientific cooperation. And these are binding agreements. As we all know, the Council works on the basis of consensus, but it is moving in this direction, which I think is very, very, very helpful and very important. And it was mentioned this morning about the agreement between the Arctic Council and the Arctic Economic Council. And again, the Arctic Council has evolved and it continues to evolve, and we must not lose sight of that fact that it can and will play an important diplomatic role. A point that was mentioned earlier, there are no currently significant boundary disputes, amongst the Arctic states. I'm sure Ambassador Oss is going to talk about the Barents Sea Agreement, Russia and the United States. We have negotiated on the maritime boundary. I believe it's never been fully concluded, but we both respect it. The Law of the Sea Convention, is obviously very, very important, a diplomatic achievement, and I wish we were members of it. I think it would give us a great deal more cachet in dealing with these issues if we would become a member of the Law of the Sea Convention. A point that Heather mentioned earlier today, most of the easily obtainable oil and gas is in very clearly defined national territories. There are no disputes about who owns what and where. The issue is, the extended territorial shelf, beyond the 200 miles. That is, the claims are being issued or being sent to the UNCLOS people. It's going according to all the regulations. Nobody is violating anything, at this particular point. So I think that's another point, that we need to keep in mind. We've talked about the Arctic Fisheries Agreement, a very significant diplomatic achievement. The moratorium on fishing in the deep Arctic Ocean and the central parts of the Arctic Ocean. That is a very important, dimension as well. And we've talked about the IMO Polar Code. So you can see if you add all this together, there is quite a bit of, diplomatic achievement. And I would certainly argue as a career diplomat, that there is great room here for creative diplomacy. Now, what are some of the specific proposals? Because we do have issues, that have to be addressed. I completely agree on the resumption of military-to-military contacts. The Coast Guard Forum is an excellent forum, but it's limited, to the Coast Guard issues. The military-to-military is much broader and I think essential at this particular time because of the military concerns that have been raised and to avoid sort of slipping into the kind of military competition that none of us wants to see again. The other thing that I would mention, this goes back to, I was in the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union collapsed. And in the post-Soviet era, we established something called the Gore-Chernomyrdin Commission. And that basically was to get our bureaucracies talking together. We talked on a whole series of issues from military to you name it. And I think I would love to see something similar, to deal with the Arctic right now. Again, this would be a bilateral thing to start with, which might make some of our good friends in the Arctic Council a little uncomfortable. But I do think that we need to reestablish some type of bilateral dialogue, with Russia on the whole sort of framework of issues, within the Arctic that we've been dealing with. Again, just to conclude, I think, diplomacy has been very successful, in the Arctic, and I think the potential is there to help us avoid, some of these dark clouds turning into rain in the future.
Thanks, Ken. And let me just say how pleased I am to be here speaking to a crowd this size, because I've been thinking about a few comments to open. And in the late 80s, when there was an initial discussion about cooperation in the Arctic, Alaskans were just completely disinterested in attending a meeting with other countries. There was a combination of, well, you guys can do your multilateral stuff. We've got our own bilaterals with countries, and Alaska's pretty much its own country, so we don't need international meetings. But I persevered. The State Department sort of said, well, let's send this junior guy up to these meetings in Canada. And at this point, I would first give a big tip of the hat to Finland. There was a career diplomat named Jaakko Rajkowski, and I always praise him. I mean, he did about 2 or 3 meetings. I remember it was my role at the State Department was to say no to cooperation, and he was in charge. And I hadn't met him for a meeting or 2, and I go up to this conference. It was some other conference, and I said, Ray Arnaudo, State Department, and he said, "You're the one who's stopping the Arctic from developing cooperation." That wasn't true. I got different instructions for the next meetings, and the rest is history. We had the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy, and then the Arctic Council. So it's all to the good. But again, as I said, I would call meetings, and I would have to call, Alaska when you send someone to the meeting. Interior, why do we need to go to an international meeting? Anyway, you're all here. You're all interested, and I'm delighted. And I think it really speaks to Arctic cooperation and the multilateral and global interest in our cooperation. So we've got a good panel here. I'm just really going to go down the line, ask people to make a few comments about their country's interests in global cooperation and global diplomacy. We'll see how much time we have left for questions at the end. I've got a few to ask, but with that, I'll turn to you, Kåre. Thanks for your comments. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Ray, and thanks to the Wilson Center's Polar Institute for inviting me, and also to the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. It's great to be here, and it's also great to hear from Ray that when Norway reached out to the State Department in the early 2000s, it was not much of a sort of dialogue we had. But I would have to say that that has really increased and been strengthened in the last, I would say, 9 years. And I think that this symposium here today also sort of demonstrates really that there is a huge interest in what's going on in the Arctic. It was also very interesting to listen to the Secretary of Energy, the Deputy Secretary, talking about Alaska and the challenges in his discussion with Fran Ulmer. And Fran, it's really great to see you again. And I have to say that what we have in the northern parts of Norway is very different from the challenges Alaska is facing. And I think that one of the reasons why I am invited here today is probably because, and you all know that 10% of the Norwegian population, they live north of the Arctic Circle. Another two figures which are important is that 30% of our land mass, and you see that on the map, that's also north of the Polar Circle. And 70% of Norwegian oceans, they are also north of the Polar Circle. So we are indeed an Arctic country, but we are also, I would say, the northern parts of Norway, they are as vibrant economically, politically, and in all other aspects as the rest of the country. And we have universities, we have infrastructure, we have. I think. I mean, you can't. When you compare the south to the north, I would probably see that it's. You can't see many differences. And I think that's one of the stories we want to convey. And we also have in the northern parts of Norway, like the rest of the country, very, very innovative businesses. Then I would also make a point that is really important to continue to work on a sustainable Arctic. And in order for that to happen, I think that, and that very much depends on healthy oceans, and but also, of course, other aspects. But healthy oceans is part of that, and that is also why Norway has taken a lead internationally on sustainable economic oceans. And my Prime Minister is heading a panel together with 13 or 15 other coastal states and islands, and they will be presenting their recommendations to the international community next June. I would also like to say that, and I agree with Ray and also with Ken, that the Arctic Council has been very, very successful, and the 8 Arctic nations, they work together without sort of, I would say, political conflicts, which we see in other arenas. And but one thing we regret really is that the Arctic Arctic Council Foreign Ministerial Meeting in Finland early this year was not able to agree on a communique because of different views on climate issues. So we regret that, and we hope that will not be the case in the future. Then I also would like to make a point that and that has been said also by Ken. I think it was that it's important that we all work for peace and stability in the Arctic. And that is, of course, the stability and the predictability we see in the Arctic is a result of political choices. It's a political choices of the Arctic family. And I would also like really to underline that there is no race for the Arctic, or that the resources in the Arctic is up for grabs. And Ken explained that very, very eloquently. They're referring to national jurisdiction, but also the law of the sea. And also what we see when there are disputes, for example, as we had with Norway, with Russia, but even before that with the Soviet Union, we were trying to reach an agreement on the delimitation in the Barents Sea with Russia for 40 years, but we achieved that back in 2010. Also, do I have some time left now? Yeah, 5 minutes now, 2 more minutes. I refer to that. I would like to make some comments on and I did that on our bilateral relations with the United States. I think what is the excellent cooperation we have with the state of Alaska and the northern parts of Norway is really, really, really important. I'm very encouraged also, I would say, by all senior officials going to Norway, but also the huge number of members of Congress visiting Norway. Just some weeks ago, we had a delegation from the Senate there, 5 senators. Later this month, we will have a bunch of members of Congress, and also in August there will be a delegation visiting Norway. And there are 4 reasons why I would say that the Congress wants to visit Norway. First of all, they want to learn about how Norway has developed, the northern parts of Norway, how we have achieved, I would say, sustainable economic development in the north, where we are, as you know, we are an oil-producing country. We are extracting oil and gas, but at the same time, we are a very, very strong agenda when it comes to preserving the environment. And we are combining that, and they want to learn from that. Second reason why they want to come is because they want to learn more about, I would say, Norway's Arctic policy in general, and that, of course, also includes the Svalbard archipelago, very close to the North Pole, and they want to have a better understanding about Norway's bilateral relationship to Russia. And I think Ken referred to that. I would say that Norway, as the rest of the international community, we are implementing the sanctions due to what happened in Crimea and Ukraine, but at the same time, we have, I would say, a very good bilateral cooperation with the Russians on search and rescue, nuclear cleanup, research, search and rescue, but also a very, very strong people-to-people cooperation on the borders between Norway and Russia. And since the European Union is here with my good colleague Marie-Anne, I would like to say that we are welcoming EU to the Arctic as an observer. We hope that issue will be solved very, very, very soon. And we very much would like to continue to engage with the European Union on these issues, which are, I would say, crucial. So one final point on other observers, like, for example, China. China, we see a positive, that it's positive that China is interested in what's happening in the Arctic. But of course, that has to be seen within the sort of the framework of the Arctic Council, and also based on the sort of the governing bodies we have in the Arctic. So I think I would end by that, Ray. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Marie-Anne?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ray. In the first place, I would like to thank very much to my friend Mike Sfraga for having invited me. I'm extremely pleased, and as was said this morning, this is a must-to-attend event. Thank you, Mike. I heard this very passionate plea presentation of Norway and the Arctic. I would like to say a few words why the Arctic is of strategic importance also for the European Union. And there are mainly 3 reasons. In the first place, because the European Union is part of the Arctic, and I explain. When I heard Senator Murkowski last year for the first time explaining to an audience why the US is an Arctic nation, she said, because of Alaska. Now, I consider that the European Union is an Arctic entity. Why? Because we have 3 of our EU member states, which are part of the European Union and part of the Arctic, and by extension, association, even 2 more, Norway and Iceland. And it means that the European Union is in the Arctic, so the European Union is not nearby or is not an outsider. And this is not purely an ideological issue. I think it is very, very important to stress this, because it concretely means that the European Union policies and the European Union very high standards that it has, for example, in fishing, climate change, safety of shipping, offshore drilling, environmental protection, applies to the European Arctic. It also means concretely that in case there are investments from third states in the European Arctic, the European very strict rules will apply. Secondly, why the Arctic is of strategic interest of the European Union is because what happens in the Arctic impacts on the whole European Union. And we have very close, extremely close linkages between the Arctic and the rest of the whole European Union. The case of the dramatic effects of climate change are clear, but I also would like to point that what happens in the European Union impacts on the Arctic. We have many activities of the European Union that have many activities in the Arctic have a European dimension. For example, we have 25% of our fish is imported from the European Union, mainly from Norway, and a lot of energy, 2/3 of gas from Norway, and it is coming from Norway and Russia. And European companies invest in the Arctic, and we have a lot of tourists traveling in the Arctic. In other words, we have a footprint in the Arctic and vice versa. And the third major reason why it's of strategic interest is that the current geoeconomic and geopolitical implications of the warming up of the Arctic have a direct impact on European Union policies. The European Union is a major global economic power, and which means that when you have the warming up of the Arctic and you have new economic possibilities and opportunities in many sectors, that will affect also European policies. Some examples. The Arctic has vast mineral reserves and such as rare earth minerals, which are crucial for the production of modern electronics. And the European Union and others, including the US, is heavily reluctant on the import of these key minerals, which mainly are for the moment being imported from other parts of the world. Secondly, the developments in the energy sector. The European Union is very much dependent on energy imports. So if you have developments, let's say in the LNG sector, it will impact on European energy policy, as it will also impact on global energy policies. And the third example is shipping. The European member states have together the largest fleet in the world. Trade of the European Union, 80 to 90% is via sea lanes and via shipping, which means in the case that you have so-called new, more accessible shipping lanes, this has a direct impact on our shipping industry and on our trade, even on global shipping. So I would say that all these reasons, the three reasons, make that the Arctic is of strategic interest for the European Union. That's why we have an Arctic policy, and that's why the European Union is very much engaged in the Arctic. I will not give an explanation about the EU's Arctic policy. I only want to stress one pillar of our policy, which is international cooperation. In general, you can say that cooperation is in the DNA of the European Union. International cooperation in the Arctic for us means that we are active in international fora, like, for example, the UN dealing with climate change, IMO, but also in the Arctic Council. And where we are active and where I think our contribution is estimated, despite our status, and where we will continue to work. But the Arctic Council is not the only exclusive body dealing with the Arctic. Another example is that we work closely together. It's in our Arctic policy. We work closely together with all Arctic members, and I underline all Arctic members. It includes also Russia. We have since more than 20 years a very good cooperation with Russia in the Arctic and in northern policies like the Northern Dimension Partnership and in the Barents Euro-Arctic Council, where we work concretely on projects, people-to-people projects and projects dealing with environment or nuclear waste treatment. Non-Arctic states also explicitly mentioned in our Arctic strategy that we want to engage with non-Arctic states which have an interest in the Arctic, where we have a common interest. And this includes, I would say, also so-called new actors, which are here the big elephant in the room. We consider that it's very important to engage with these new actors who are increasingly engaged in the Arctic, not because we are naive, but we think that we need joint forces with these countries in order to tackle major challenges like, for example, climate change, and also to ensure that there is a respect for international law. And last but not least, we are very closely engaged with Arctic stakeholders. The European Union has a yearly dialogue with the people, the indigenous people and local communities, and their voice must be heard. Final word about geopolitics and security in the Arctic. The recent developments, and it has been said also by Senator Murkowski, that the new reality is that geopolitics have an impact on the Arctic. And I was also present at the Munich Security Roundtable on the Arctic in Helsinki, where the Finnish minister said you cannot put a plate message, do not disturb, on the Arctic. We consider that the biggest risk of to security in the Arctic is a possible spillover of conflicts from outside into the Arctic. And there are examples, and I can share this with the lady who would like to have a concrete example. But therefore, what is needed to avoid this kind of conflicts is Arctic diplomacy, it's cooperation, not confrontation, confidence-building measures, it's regional cooperation, which is key, and also, I would say, more communication, more dialogue on security issues. And finally, we are very grateful to Finland. Finland, not only for excellent Arctic Council chairmanship, but also now Finland is having the EU presidency of the European Union and has put for the very first time in history the Arctic high on the agenda. And to conclude, extremely grateful to the Wilson Center putting the Arctic high up on its agenda. This is the place where the Arctic belongs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And now turn to Canada.
It's working.
It's working.
Is it going?
Yeah, I think it's on.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thank you so much for inviting me. This is a very interesting discussion, and I will try to be brief and allow a bit of time for everyone to speak and maybe a little bit of time for questions. So I'll try to be brief. I'll share some overarching information around how Canada is approaching Arctic cooperation, Arctic diplomacy, but also domestic Arctic policy for our country. At the core of the way in which we are structuring our Arctic policy, whether it be national or international, is the people of the North and the land of the North being at the center of the way in which we want to organize our policies and priorities. Our government is really firmly of the view that nobody knows the Arctic, both its abundances and its opportunities, but also its challenges, like the people who live there. And so both the way in which we are approaching, but also the choices that we are making, but also the way in which we are developing our policy has that very much at its core. In terms of the policies that we are developing, really our vision has a handful of components, and most of them have already been mentioned here. A stable and secure Arctic, a rules-based region that respects the rules that already exist and govern the territory of the Arctic nations, dynamic economic growth, sustainable growth, vibrant northern communities that are able to survive in a healthy but also in an economically vibrant manner and grow, and of course, very healthy and productive ecosystems. And I think that those priorities are, as have been mentioned so far and as we know, very much shared by all of our neighbors in the Arctic community, but also by our partners that we're working with around the globe that are interested in Arctic issues, but are not Arctic nations. As folks here have heard today, the landscape has shifted physically and economically in the past 20 to 25 years significantly, with climate change driving much of this change. And it's clearly going to evolve over the coming decades. That will have an impact on people's lives, on their social structures, on the way in which transportation and economic activities are taking place, and potentially security and other tensions that will arise. So with this ongoing transformation and this increased interest in the region, the impact that this is having on the inhabitants is very essential to the way we're looking at the region and at our policies. It was reinforced at the Arctic Council Ministerial this past May that this is an area of peace and stability, and I think it's important to emphasize that. The reason that we have this environment of peace and stability is because of the cooperation, the dialogue, and the respect for the rules order that governs the region. So we're very keen on ensuring that we do what it takes for it to remain that way. So let me talk a little bit about the Arctic Council and our perception and our activities in the Arctic Council. From our perspective, it is a world-leading example of what can be done when countries focus on a collective good, the greater good of everyone, cooperation, and working together to raise everybody up. We can be proud of the extensive legal and institutional framework. We're really pleased with the early successes of the implementation of the Science Cooperation Agreement, which is going to help scientists produce the data needed to make informed decisions. We are really happy, in particular, with the incorporation of valuable insights from our Indigenous peoples in those discussions. With non-Arctic states, we're really also very pleased with the agreement to protect unregulated high sea fisheries in the Central Arctic Ocean. We think that is an excellent example of taking an evidence-based approach to dealing with sustainability of the future commercial fisheries in that region. So these concrete actions are hugely important, but also the discussion and the continued cooperation and the relationship building that happens naturally within the forum can't be undervalued. Maybe just turning to bilateral and our partnership with the United States in particular, since we are here in the US. Canada's cooperation with the United States in the Arctic is also very centered on people to people. We have a lot of discussions around resources. Our Prime Minister and the President just launched an action plan on critical minerals that we will be working on over the coming months. A lot of those reserves in Canada exist either in the high north or in the Arctic region. We have a lot of joint science activities, rescue activities, and of course, very important defense, bilateral defense through NORAD, which is the North American Aerospace Defense Command, which is a joint command of Canada and US. So we have daily, if I can say, interactions in a variety of ways, also diplomatically and bilaterally with the US. A couple of people have mentioned, I think it's worth reiterating, that it's important to work with countries far from the Arctic, where we have areas of common interest, to make sure that these countries and these partners understand the realities of the region and the realities for us of our north and the impacts of the changing environment on our north. We know that what happens in the Arctic isn't only caused by activities in the region, and likewise, what happens in the Arctic will affect, so the causes on the Arctic are coming from outside of our communities, but the effect of the changes in the Arctic will ripple down to communities outside of Arctic nations. So we are very open to collaboration within our family, if I can put it, of Arctic nations, and within the larger global community. And one of the areas that we're quite excited about is Arctic research. We have a high Arctic research station in Nunavut, which is now operational, and we're encouraging US scientists and we're encouraging scientists from the Arctic Council countries and around the world to join us there as soon as possible. So maybe looking to the future, I think that what I'd like to say is that the strides that we have made, the cooperation that we are undertaking internationally is crucial. I've talked a lot about our focus on people and the planet and the ecosystems and economic development. But we're also deeply committed to ensuring that the Canadian Arctic, the North, and the people that live in the North are secure and well defended. And in that respect, we all know that all of these pieces are interconnected. We monitor the region for future challenges and current activities. We're guided by our Canadian Rangers, who are actually our northern communities, and we're going to continue to work with them and other key partners with the Canadian Armed Forces to make sure that we are safe and secure, as well as prosperous and healthy and environmentally sustainable and everything else we hope to be. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. And last, Mike, I'm going to ask for a couple of extra minutes since we started about 5 minutes late, so if you don't mind, since I don't want to rush these comments, it's a very good exchange. Presentation, and I'd like to have a little exchange after. But, so, turning to...
Thank you, Mike Spraga, and organizers for inviting me also here. It's great to be here in Washington, and I haven't really been here too often. Great place to be and visit. I would like to also thank Ambassador Marie-Anne Coninsx for the kind words concerning Finnish chairmanship in the Arctic Council and now our presidency in the Union. And somehow that reminded me about Finland joining the European Union in 1995. We were keen, happy, and we were identifying ourselves also, of course, as a member, full member, but also as a new Mediterranean country, as we were starting to be quite active in the Mediterranean cooperation. So, of course, we found justification to that as we were member state to be something what we wanted. I don't know whether we can refer to any other cases who are not members but observers. But, of course, countries can identify themselves as what they want. In 1999, we had the first presidency in the European Union, and actually now this year we are celebrating now 20th anniversary of establishing the Northern Dimension as the EU policies. And later on, Russia, Norway, Iceland became equal partners there, and I have to say I fully agree that it has been a success story, and we have a lot of positive things to tell about that. Not only these nuclear issues, waste issues, but we can see clearly, for example, in the Baltic Sea that the water and sea is much cleaner than what it was, because we have been putting a lot of European money also, national money and from the region to clear the or improve the St. Petersburg wastewater treatment facility. So these examples encourage us also to work in other instances, and that has been the case also in the Arctic Council. As a reminder, you remember that during our 2 years chairmanship, our theme was exploring common solutions, and we had two cross-cutting themes: Agenda 2030, sustainable development, then environmental protection, education, connectivity, and meteorology. And then last one, actually, we found very useful new element in the Arctic Council, and it opened also the way to think these many issues more in a total context, in a holistic way. And I have to say that we consider that our chairmanship, we followed the chairmanship program well. We achieved the goals, and what happened in Rovaniemi, we didn't get the declaration, which was signed by the ministers, but we got chairman's statement, what was actually that what was due to be the common declaration, and we got a signed statement by all members also that we can keep going in the same way, actually, what we have been doing before. Of course, some media representatives consider that as a failure, as we didn't, first time in the Arctic Council's history since 1996 to have a declaration, but then we can ask what is the meaning of the declaration if perhaps most of the people, they don't even know what was the previous declaration and what was done in the Fairbanks and so on. So diplomatically we can have different views, but when we go to have a look of this work in practice, so I don't see any big differences. USA has been withdrawing from that declaration concerning the black carbon mitigation, but we see also and hear that in principle and practice the emissions have been in those limits what was agreed some years ago. So practical things go on and real life goes on, and diplomacy is what it is. We have seen a lot of challenges in international politics and Arctic Council in a way, even it's not an international organization, only a forum, so it is not exception either in the way. And when we are speaking about this don't disturb plate, so everything concerns also what is happening in the world Arctic and Arctic cooperation in its all forms. We were happy also to see that IMO, International Maritime Organization, was agreed to be an observer. There is a memorandum of understanding between the Arctic Economic Council and the Arctic Council. And the Coast Guard Forum has been doing a great job, and it has been in close contact also with the Arctic Council and member states, and I think this will be going on. Our aim was also, or we offered a chance to have a summit during our chairmanship to deal with these black carbon issues, shipping, maritime issues. We didn't manage to meet the conditions, you know the reasons. But I can say that it wasn't actually dependent of the chairmanship, and our president a month ago said that actually the offer is still valid, and we can even have a summit whenever needed, and it can even consider some security issues, because those are not considered in the Arctic Council, and it could take away a little bit this burden from that daily work from the Arctic Council to the heads of the states. So let's see if that will be an opportunity and real. But anyway, the offer is really still valid, and it is certainly part of this Arctic diplomacy where we now, after the Rovaniemi meeting, need creative thinking, where we need efforts to create confidence building between countries, and actually Arctic Council itself is a confidence building measure. I think that, and I'm personally very optimistic in a way that even world is facing a lot of challenges, so all countries have an interest in the Arctic to keep it peaceful, and where we have to continue the constructive cooperation and use the resources and opportunities in the most sustainable way. And if there will be conflicts coming outside Arctic, we have to take care that Arctic is not bringing from Arctic conflicts or problems to the other parts of the world. And if we solve those, I think it is basically in the international framework. I don't think that actually this plate or exceptionalism, don't disturb plate, is something quite clever expression in this context. What about all these security policy challenges in the Arctic? So I think that if we are speaking about climate change, we are very often saying that technology helps. And I think that also technology can help us in security policy issues. Our world will be much more transparent. It is already more transparent, and transparency helps a lot in solving the problems. And let's see, but we shouldn't be too much pessimistic in considering our future, because our kids feel also that, and we have noticed that in many demonstrations and expressions by young people, that we have to do something, and we by doing, we have to create optimism. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we wrap this up. Can I, quick question maybe? let's just say, simple question, I think it's maybe a good way to end this conference, but say 1 minute. What's the biggest issue, what's the biggest problem facing your country in the Arctic?
I think, Ray, that what is important is really for the international community to address the climate changes, which we see also affect the Arctic in a significant way, and also, of course, to preserve the Arctic, as has been said, a region of low tension and stability. And one more sentence, my final sentence is really that it has been referred to the sort of the security challenges in the Arctic. I think we have to sort of, what I would like to say that, and it was also said by another here in the panel, is really that this is a region of stability and predictability and a region of peace. That we have to preserve. And if there are security challenges in the Arctic, the body to discuss those issues is NATO and not the Arctic Council. Thank you.
Good. Comment?
It's not a country I'm speaking for, but
many countries.
No, for the Union, I would say the major challenge is to fight against climate change and the protection of the fragile Arctic environment. That's absolutely key to achieve this. Also in the interest of the region, of its people, and the rest of the globe. And if we are having economic development, the focus should be absolutely on sustainability. You can only, I would say, to have economic development, there's no other option than to have economic development, but it should be sustainable and with due respect of the environment and climate change. And I forgot to add one point, is that in our whole policy we have the big support of science and technology. We are, I think, one of the biggest researchers on Arctic research, and I want to say this in the presence of Hreinn, that we were extremely pleased that last year, together the European Union with Finland and Germany, we organized the second Arctic Science Ministerial, a very successful one.
Thank you. Ken?
This is going to sound very similar. I think that it's climate change and the rapid change of economic, social, potentially security challenges that are coming because of the effects of climate change.
Thank you.
Climate change, but also a holistic approach that we use our technology in that fight. Everything goes actually at the end hand in hand.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, panel. Just a final comment. I meant to mention it in my intro, but a special thanks to the people who were first in the Arctic, the indigenous communities, because they're the ones who, and Canada pushed this quite heavily, needed to be in the meetings when we first started discussions about Arctic cooperation. And I feel quite good that we were sort of pioneers in that with international organizations. So with that, panel, thank you very much for all. And
thank you, Ray. Please thank this fantastic panel.
Yeah,
thank you.
So you know my wife. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I was just going to send you a note.
Our final presentation today, purposefully placed, will focus on Iceland's chairmanship of the Arctic Council. We did this specifically to wrap the day, but also to foreshadow tomorrow, and we knew that we would be navigating a lot of issues. So with that, I'd like to invite to the podium the Deputy Chief of Mission, the Embassy of Iceland to the United States, Deputy Chief of Mission, Pálsson. Sir, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you to all the organizers here today for the opportunity to come here and tell you a little bit about the Icelandic chairmanship priorities. I would also keenly aware that I'm the only thing standing in the way of the festivities outside, so I'll try to be as quick and concise as I can possibly be, and I will be available in the reception if you have any follow-ups or questions regarding the presentation that I'm about to give. This morning we had Senator Murkowski kind of throw down the gauntlet, saying that we had, if I remember correctly, the fate of the Arctic in our hands in the Icelandic chairmanship. Senator Murkowski is a good friend of Iceland, but that's a high standard and to live up to. But we will do our best to steer the Arctic Council through the next 2 years, and I will go through a couple of the things that we want to add to the agenda during that time. So can we go to the first slide, maybe? No. All right. Sustainable development. Thank you very Sustainable development will serve as the overarching theme of the Icelandic chairmanship. This draws both on the Ottawa Declaration and on Icelandic experiences. Iceland will emphasize development and growth in the Arctic, and we will focus on balancing 3 pillars of sustainable development. Not just the environmental, but also the economic and the social factors. The Arctic Council has been successful in bringing the Arctic states together in cooperation, and we fully intend to strengthen that. Active involvement of the indigenous people organizations, the so-called permanent participants, is an immensely important and unique in international cooperation. And the active involvement of the observer states is also an important factor for us to have as part of this program. And now we have just a quick video to emphasize with the emphasis of our chairmanship program. Together towards a sustainable Arctic is the emphasis. So we will be focusing on 4 main areas during the chairmanship program. The first one being the Arctic marine issues, with a special focus on both plastics in the Arctic Ocean and on the blue bioeconomy. We will also be focusing on climate and green energy solutions, which have been mentioned here today by the Deputy Secretary of Energy. And we will also focus on people in the Arctic and welfare issues, including building resilience in the Arctic for youth, as well as gender equality. And the fourth and last issue is stronger Arctic Council. That being said, it is important to note that the most of the great work and projects underway within the Arctic Council and its working groups continue. The Icelandic chairmanship will, with our specific priority areas, only add to the work that is already being done. We're not reinventing the wheel, we are just continuing the good work that was done by the Finnish chairmanship and the US one before, and the other ones that went ahead of that. Now, just quickly to go through those 4 main priorities. It is no coincidence that the oceans are at the top of Iceland's agenda. We are citizens of an island in the North Atlantic Ocean, and not to mention that the lion's share of the Arctic region is covered by ocean. And the welfare and the livelihood of a large part of its population in the Arctic is based on the sustainable utilization of marine resources. Projects are an important part of the Arctic Council's work, and some of those we emphasize are listed on these slides. 80 to 100 projects are ongoing under the auspices of the Arctic Council working groups and expert groups. Regional action plan, Iceland will emphasize a regional action plan to reduce marine litter and is organizing an international scientific conference on plastic pollution in the Arctic and submarine environment. This, of course, goes to something that is well known here in the US, the Save Our Seas initiative that Senator Sullivan has been pioneering and now signed into law a short while ago, and I believe there is a follow-up coming according to the Senator. We will also be emphasizing issues of safety at sea, pollution prevention, ocean acidification, and Arctic marine tourism as highlights. We will furthermore be introducing new projects focusing on innovation and efficient utilization of marine biological resources, or the so-called blue bioeconomy. The fishing industry is still throwing away an average of 50% of the catches. In Iceland, we have managed to increase the use to over 75% on average, and we have seen individual companies manage to reach up to 100% utilization. Such innovative methods multiply the value of each kilo out of the ocean which could continue to be increasing the prosperity and sustainability for the remote Arctic communities. We will also continue an emphasis on meteorological cooperation. And while Iceland chairs the Arctic Council, our Coast Guard shoulders the leadership of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum, which has been mentioned here before, where the council chairmanship handover is done through the ministerials, the Arctic Coast Guard Forum changes over with exercises. And the Icelandic Coast Guard will be hosting an exercise in April 2021 to hand over its chairmanship. The second one is climate and green energy solutions. Iceland has a long history of harnessing a renewable energy, both hydro and geothermal. Many Arctic communities still rely solely on fossil fuels, as we have discussed here today. Finding alternative energy sources will contribute to improving the air quality, which will be beneficial to human health in the region. A recent Arctic Council project called the Arctic Remote Energy Networks Academy, ARENA, which was mentioned earlier by the Undersecretary, is a project that seeks to find a practical solution for small communities and to share best practice in this field. And we will look forward to trying to focus on this project. Iceland also wants to continue the work on expert groups on black carbon, which has also been mentioned that was part of the Finnish chairmanship. And we want to introduce two new initiatives. One is an assessment on the retreat of Arctic glaciers, and the second one is an assessment on freshwater inflow and accumulation in the Arctic Ocean, both scientific projects related to this energy and sustainability. We will also have a little focus on people in the Arctic. The Arctic is a diverse region providing home to around 4 million people. Iceland wishes to initiate a discussion on preventive measures relating to alcohol and substance abuse amongst young people. This is a project that Iceland has some positive experience in ourselves, and we want to share the experience and seek to get that knowledge out to the communities and see if we can use solutions that were developed in Iceland. We also want to continue the cooperation on ongoing subjects such as connectivity and social well-being in the Arctic. That includes gender equality, which is a topic that Iceland has promoted within the Arctic Council since 2013. And finally, we aim for a stronger Arctic Council. Iceland intends to give due attention to the inner workings of the Arctic Council with consultations and to continue to develop ways to engage with the observers and in an enhanced manner. We also mentioned here today the Arctic Economic Council, and that will celebrate 5 years anniversary during Iceland's chairmanship. Iceland will seize that opportunity to enhance its collaboration with the Arctic Council and devote more attention to economic cooperation through cooperation between the Council, Economic Council, and the Arctic Council. Finally, and just before we everybody gets to join in the festivities outside, just to mention a few events that will be taking place during the Arctic Chairmanship. I will highlight 3 of these, specifically in relation to the last thing that I mentioned. The joint meeting of senior Arctic officials and representatives of the Arctic Economic Council will take place in October in 2019, a part of the project to try to enhance cooperation between these two elements. And then the scientific conference on plastics pollutions in Arctic Ocean, which will take place in Iceland in April 2020, and a follow-up meeting which we are calling an Arctic Ocean Ministers meeting in the spring of 2020 that will follow up on the conclusions of the scientific. We're calling it an Arctic Oceans Ministers because there are different ministries responsible for the oceans within different member countries. In Iceland's case, it will be the Minister for the Environment and the Minister for Fisheries who will co-host the meeting on Iceland's behalf. And I would be amiss not to mention, of course, even though that is not part of our Arctic chairmanship and it's not a government project, that of course the Arctic Circle meeting will take place in Iceland in October with all kinds of side events related to that. So that's a quick overview about the Icelandic chairmanship. Like I said, I stand ready to answer any all questions, but to get you to the festivities, I think I'll do that outside. And thank you very much for your attention, and thank you, Mike.
Thank you, my friend. We have a wonderful partner with the Icelandic Embassy and Deputy Chief of Mission Pálsson, because he always tries to be so cooperative in so many ways in and out of the Arctic, like timing today. We're only a few minutes over our assigned time. I want to thank you all. This started at 8 a.m. and here it is a little after 5 p.m., but you've all hung in there because the content has been wonderful. We start again tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. But let me just say two things before we head out. One is that the Wilson Center and I and my colleagues here have received a lot of kudos. It's not just the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'd like to thank John Farrell of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. Where's John? Is he out with the wine? Is that what's happening? Okay, well, when you see John, you thank him. He's back there. John Farrell. Because we all know who does the work. It is John Farrell that has led this effort, and I've been fortunate enough to partner with him. Also, Commander Heather Quilindaro. I thought I saw a commander there. Heather, thank you so much. From the National Ice Center. And our colleague John Woods as well. I think I saw John right there. John, thank you. So this has been a team effort of multiple institutions, and tomorrow we will see even more of the institutions that have helped to put this day together. Again, I want to thank you all very much for a wonderful day. We start again tomorrow with a full day. You'll see overlap, a big Venn diagram of Arctic issues. And I want to thank Akama once again for supporting what you will now go enjoy, our reception. So thank you very much for your attention throughout the entire day. Thank you.